Hello, and welcome to Aviation 101 with Laura. I have always loved aircraft history, and today I want to bring you a distillation of the history of aircraft dispatchers. Where did they come from, and how did we get where we are today? Now, this is a bunch of research that I did that was based on a conference I went to, and then did a lot of digging on my own and kind of put it all together. We'll put a link in the video description if you want to read the article I wrote about this. But we are just going to go through in kind of quick order the history of aircraft dispatchers. I'm not going to go into big detail on most of these accidents, but I will put links to where you can read more about them if it piques your interest. Now, quickly on, as we started transporting people with railroads, railroad companies figured out that we needed to have control over what train was on what track. And so they established a system of telegraph, which allowed the station operators to monitor movements of the trains along the track and, in theory, prevent collisions from occurring. But the reason that I bring up telegraphs in relation to aircraft dispatchers is that this really led to radios, the idea of being able to communicate with a moving vehicle while it's in operation by some kind of station operator. And in my research, I found that as early as 1916, there was a guy named Lawrence Sperry who attached lights to the wings of an aircraft to send Morse code signals to a ground station. That's obviously not very practical because if you can't see the aircraft, it can't communicate. But radio technology wasn't quite where it needed to be yet for airplanes to be able to transmit to ground stations. But it was coming. The point is, people recognized that, especially in these early days, flying the mail would be much better if we could communicate with pilots while they were in flight. And so when I did my research, I found in 1929 this ad for Boeing Air Transport where the dispatcher was actually mentioned, and that's really the first time I mentioned it or found it. That was in Aviation Week Technology magazine. And basically the ad copy said that the aircraft dispatcher was in touch with the pilots to give weather information, and they had installed their system in 18 different ground stations and all its aircraft. This is really similar to the description, if you read it, of the modern dispatcher. But along the way, airlines also started using dispatchers back then as air traffic controllers, actually. I found this description in Aviation Week, March 1933, where we had a lighting control desk that it said was reported to be operated by the dispatcher. Now, Newark Airport had a supposedly really high arrival rate, 64 aircrafts arriving every day. Not in an hour, but in a day, right? So this idea of controlling traffic, the dispatcher controlling traffic, led to what I found in a different issue of Aviation magazine back from the 1930s. This kind of complicated diagram. I'm not going to explain it, but basically a dispatcher was the one who would allow the aircraft to come in for a landing and give approval for landing, and they would communicate with the pilots. But this quickly actually became abandoned because the United States government initiated its own program to staff air traffic control, and it took dispatchers out of the equation because it realized that dispatchers worked for various airlines and they were going to want to prioritize their own airplanes from their own company with landing, and it was kind of a convoluted system, as you can see by this diagram. And so in 1937, on June 6, they actually launched the first aircraft dispatcher when at the time, the Bureau of Air Commerce certificated several hundred airline dispatchers all together on the same day. So that created the aircraft dispatcher certificate. Now, in these early days, I want to back up just a little bit and look at some safety statistics and review these. Now, I did a bunch of digging into accident rates back in the 1930s, which is a little hard to come by. But I did a count and found 45 different accidents that involved 3 or more people, just the United States, between 1930 and 1937. In fact, the rate was so high that in 1932 we had 15 deaths per 100 million passenger miles flown. Now, preview of the very end of my talk about history. Here are the rates now. In 1980, 0.034 passenger fatalities per 100 million. Wow. And back in 1932, we're talking about 15 passenger fatalities per 100 million miles flown. And you can see here, it went down exponentially quickly. Now, the reasons is multiple, not just dispatchers. But I just want to put that accident rate into perspective as we go forward talking about this. I have this picture of a Curtiss Condor that was involved in American Airlines Flight 166. Like I say, I'm not going into great detail because I'm going to link the accident information in the video description, but this aircraft was a probable cause assigned as the dispatcher was involved in this accident, crashing actually due to poor weather forecasting and accumulating ice on the fuselage. Now, there was another accident around this time, 1935, that I am going to unpack a bit more. It was TWA Flight 6. And a senator, Bronson Cutting, was killed in the accident. And this really launched a big inquiry by the government of what was going on with airline travel. Why is it so many airplanes are crashing? The flight was dispatched without the ability to communicate with anybody on the night radio frequency. At the time, they had a night radio frequency and a day radio frequency, and this airplane was flying at night. It had poor weather forecasting, and unfortunately, when it arrived to Kansas City, where it was supposed to land, it could not land because the weather had gotten so horrible that the flight crew could not see the ground. And secondly, the alternate airport where it was supposed to go for better weather, it hadn't been planned correctly either. And essentially what happened was the airplane ran out of fuel while attempting to land by just descending randomly through clouds to hope to find a field to land on. This didn't work. The airplane crashed. Actually, not everybody was killed, but one of the people that was killed was this senator. The government, when they initiated the investigation, found a failure of TWA's ground personnel at Kansas City to redispatch the aircraft to an airport where better weather existed when they had failed to plan the flight adequately. And this led to the concept of operational control. Now, this is a really long quote. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially, this was also documented in Aviation magazine by 1937. There is the concept of the dispatcher sharing what we call operational control with the pilot. And essentially, both the dispatcher and the pilot were allowed to cancel a flight. And so here is the definition from part 1.1 of operational control. Exercise of authority over initiating, conducting, or terminating a flight. And what TWA did after this accident was they put a bunch of their pilots actually in dispatch office and said, you know what, you guys are going to help. We're going to have pre-planned alternates. We're going to have a direction pre-identified where you're going to fly. If you have a radio failure, we're going to actually have flight kits with adequate charts for the pilots. We're going to actually check our fuel burn, and we're going to have pilots checking pilots, which basically was an elevation of dispatch to this level of operational control, where two people have control over whether that flight leaves, continues, or gets put to another airport. It's the pilot in command and the aircraft dispatcher. So this is really an important concept. Going forward, I'm going to fast forward actually to the 1940s and 1950s because during that period and even into the 60s, there was a period of supplemental air carriers. Now, at a supplemental air carrier, many of them began very quickly after World War II because there was a lot of surplus, large airplanes available. Returning pilots from the war started up mini airlines where they took charter flights. And unfortunately, between 1960 and 1961, there were 7 accidents from supplemental air carriers that had the result of 255 people being killed in 7 accidents. One was an entire college football team, and another was 74 Army recruits. This was bad, clearly very bad, and there was outrage from the public and said, what is going on? I thought these were airlines. They don't seem to be safe. And come to find out, under supplemental rules, dispatchers were not required. Nobody was sharing operational control with the pilot in command. It was just the pilot in command. And so in 1963, the regulations were changed to add something called a flight follower. This title still exists today, actually. Supplemental air carriers, which operate charter flights in the United States, are allowed to have operational control shared between the pilot in command and the director of operations. The director of operations can delegate operational control functions to the flight follower, but the director of operations retains the responsibility for what those flight followers do. And so the flight following system had to be initiated. This is just an excerpt from the Federal Register when that was put into place, but it showed the FAA at the time, the brand newly created FAA recognized that operational control was key to the safety of aircraft operations. Now, as we moved into the 60s, there actually began to be some more accidents that were caused by larger airplanes landing on smaller runways. And in the early 60s, there were a fair amount of these overrun accidents. Unfortunately, here's an example of one of them, Continental Airlines Flight 12. It ended up landing and hydroplaning on a wet runway. Despite the wrecked up fuselage you can see here, nobody was actually killed. But the FAA began to require dispatchers to perform landing distance calculation changes. They added a requirement for wet or icy runways by an extra 15% distance. And the dispatchers began to be involved in this planning process as well. Also around this time, actually in the late 40s, very early 50s, weather radar became another tool that aircraft dispatchers and pilots could use. And once weather radar was installed in aircraft, pilots loved it. Pilots absolutely loved it because now they could see through areas where previously they were hoping there were not embedded thunderstorms. They were navigating around thunderstorms mainly by sight, but weather radar became very quickly trusted by crews and by dispatchers. And so, but unfortunately, with that trust placed on this equipment, weather radar, there was a string of accidents coming out of placing almost too much trust in weather radar, such that dispatchers began to expect pilots to avoid severe weather areas and just completely fail to provide information to the crews on the severe weather en route. One of these accidents in particular that I want to just briefly mention is Braniff Flight 250. This was a VAC 111 in 1966, where the dispatchers were aware that other flights had been diverted or delayed, but they didn't inform the accident crew. And a really severe gust of wind destroyed the entire tail section of the aircraft. And the dispatcher testified to the, again, very early NTSB in 1968. If he received a severe weather warning for an area where a company aircraft was operating, he said it was actually doubtful if he would give that information to the aircraft because his opinion was that crews using onboard weather radar would be better able to evaluate the weather than the dispatcher. In this accident, 42 people were killed. I have actually another video kind of unpacking weather radar in more detail, but this accident was clearly showing dispatchers were saying, oh, crews, have fun. Take a look at the weather radar. You've got it. I'm not going to update you, which was faulty and unfortunate for the aircraft dispatcher. But thankfully, we learned from these lessons as well. Now, a little bit more about operational control and dispatch. Again, put the regulation up here. Exercise of authority over initiating, conducting, terminating a flight, shared between the pilot in command and the aircraft dispatcher. What happens when we don't have operational control? What can potentially happen? Here is an accident that occurred in 1990 of Avianca Flight 52, where the NTSB, in its investigation, this actually happened in the United States, so the NTSB investigated, even though it was not a U.S. air carrier, and found this aircraft ran out of fuel, completely dry, without the ability to land at JFK Airport. The weather was horrible, but there was miscommunication going on. There was no dispatcher backing anybody up, no dispatcher for the crew to communicate with, and you can see the NTSB said contributing to this accident directly was no operational control dispatch system. No dispatcher monitoring the fuel and giving the pilot information about where to go when the weather was very poor and they could not land at their original destination. So, what can we learn from all this? What has history taught us? Don't become complacent or err on the conservative side, okay? Put yourself as the dispatcher. Put yourself in the cockpit. Think about what the crew is going through. Do not just sit there and go, well, I guess they have the weather. Don't back yourself in a corner. Always, we should be looking to what we could help the crew with. Have a backup plan. If you don't have a backup plan, there is a problem and the operation needs to be stopped. So, as a dispatcher, make sure you're listening to the flight crews, your coworkers, getting advice, and looking to break that chain of events that could cause an accident. Finally, like I mentioned, here's the statistics review on passenger fatalities. And you can see since like February 2009, Colgan accident, which I have another video about that, there's only been one passenger fatality on a U.S. air carrier, and that was a uncontrolled engine coming apart and punching the fuselage at a Southwest flight. So the statistics show operational control has increased aviation safety. Of course, many other factors have gone into this, like I mentioned, radar, other improvements to maintenance, other improvements to reliability of engines, all kinds of things. But that idea of operational control pioneered by aircraft dispatchers has really enhanced safety. So I hope you learned something about aircraft dispatchers. Don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my channel for all kinds of other resources about aviation and aircraft dispatchers. Have a great day.